Hi guys, I'm Chris,
And I'm Mike.
and welcome back to this week's No Limits Rapp podcast. How you doing this week, Mike?
I'm doing great, but congrats again to you. Another life event for the Furman family. Congrats on the move and the new house.
Seems to be a weekly occurrence here. Yes, we just moved, and well, I guess we'll just say on the top. Because of the move, we had to bump back part 2 of our American Assassin, but it'll be worth the wait. We'll get to that in a second. But yeah, we just moved into our new house in Columbia, Maryland, and I still have yet to set up the Wi-Fi. So that's
Right.
why, you know, things you have to think about when you have a podcast.
Yeah, internet might need to be a priority in your next move, Chris. Make that the first thing on your checklist.
Well, I got the gig, so I got the gig speed. I went for the big, the big heavy hitter.
Nice.
It actually came today when I got home, so it's in a big box.
Oh, so you just were too lazy to set it up.
Yeah, well, I got home at 9:30, so and then I rolled right into this. So yeah, that's where we are.
Yeah, but all that is the reason we, again, are going to have to push back our American Assassin Part 2. But there is a positive side to you guys waiting and being patient, is that we've decided next week to go live. We are going to deliver a live podcast event, live streaming through Facebook. So if you're not already a Facebook member of the No Limits Rapp Pod Facebook group, go ahead, join that group, search it up, and you can get a notification Wednesday, that is the 23rd of June, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. We will be doing American Assassin Part 2 live.
That'll be exciting.
Yeah, but you know what that means? If we're live for Part 2, the people are getting a live limerick. And
a live limerick off the cuff or pre-planned?
Oh, no. These things take time. This will be planned out.
Okay.
I don't know if I could freestyle a limerick. You're putting me on the spot now. That'll be tough. But they get the cover review. Judge a book by its cover. That'll be fun live.
Yeah, a lot of covers for this book.
Yeah, what do we have,
like covers.
15 of them?
I think so. Yeah, a lot of covers. And a lot of interest in the covers. So we've been posting a lot on social media. Got a lot of interaction with our movie review pod.
Right.
Today on Insta, Dawn, she posted, "Tell me how you really feel, Mike." I thought that was funny. So,
did you see the Twitter poll? I was shot down big time. No one else joined me on the D train or the F train with that one. A lot of C pluses.
A lot of C pluses.
You were right there in the wheelhouse. A lot of people thought.
But someone added in an F. Like I thought that was funny.
That's true. I did see that. So shout out to whoever on Facebook added an F on the poll. You and I are on the same wavelength, but Dawn, not so much. Dawn's up there with Katie in the B+.
Yeah, with the B+ range.
Big fan.
That was a good pod. Go give it a listen if you haven't already done that. And so this allows you one more week to call us up. We have a Google Voice line. That number is 202-599-7770. And, we have a couple of voicemails. We even have one limerick. So
Yes.
We would love to hear from you. Share anything. Your Rapp origin story. Your thoughts on the American Assassin movie. Your thoughts on the American Assassin book. Any book. We just want to hear from you. This is such a great community, and we really want to share, thoughts from you guys on this live in-person pod. So yeah, that'd be great. Even a limerick. We have another one. Would love like a little limerick off.
Maybe we'll do a listener appreciation at some point soon, and recap some of these voicemails, different reviews that people have left us, and social media engagement. But speaking of reviews, one way you can always get involved, besides watching next week's live stream or calling in to the podcast voicemail, You can also leave us a review, 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. Makes a big difference. Helps get the word out there. And click the little write a review button and tell us what you think. Just don't trash me over my rating of the American Assassin movie and Dylan O'Brien, but rate us on the other 61 episodes.
Yes, please.
Speaking of engagement, though, we always thank our patrons. You guys make the show possible. And just a reminder, next week, also on our live episode, next Wednesday, or, well, when you guys listen to this, a few days from the release of this episode, we'll be giving away a copy of American Assassin, the movie, a Blu-ray copy. So if you would like a chance at that giveaway and you'd like to support our efforts in creating this podcast, just go to patreon.com/MitchRappPod and sign up to give back and help support the podcast.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Otherwise, what are we covering today, Chris? We got a special one today. Good interview.
Yes, this was, we've had actually a string of pretty good hosts where they've been, I love all of our, I'm not hosts, guests. I love all of our guests, but these last three, I feel like I've really gotten a lot of education out of
Right.
each one of them. But with this one, it was awesome. I felt when we got off the phone call, I could have talked to him for I don't know, at least 2 more hours, if not longer. So today we have a expert in all things Beirut, Lebanon, the intelligence field, and that is the very one, the only Fred Burton. Fans of the pod who also listen to Jack Carr's Danger Close will know that he was in the last month on that. And so because American Assassin takes place, I guess 50% of the time in Lebanon, in Beirut, and just hearing him describe some of these places, we thought it would be cool to pick his brain, find out a little bit more about his time there, discuss the book, which he actually read for us because he had never actually read a Vince Flynn novel, but he said he's going to read some more. Yeah, so this was a great interview. I really hope you guys enjoy it. And yeah, here it is.
Today we welcome a very special guest, someone with years, or dare I say, decades of experience in the intelligence services, someone you may know from the fantastic books, Beirut Rules, Ghost, among many others. Welcome to the podcast, Fred Burton.
Yes, welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Chris and Mike, for having me on. That's very kind of you.
Yeah, well, I heard a lot about your backstory on the Danger Close podcast with Jack Carr just last month. I've already picked up a few of your books and really fascinated by not only this time period in history you cover, really all these different events and terrorism from the 1980s to the present day. How about you take us through your past, your backstory, what got you to where you are today, and how you got involved in the intelligence industry?
Well, first, Mike and Chris, thank you so much for having me. And Jack Carr has really been a very good friend, and I certainly thank him for all the support he's given me over the past few years. I kind of backed into the counterterrorism space, which I talked about in my first book, Ghost, which was my memoir. I was a cop, and I wanted to be a federal agent. So I applied to this organization that, quite frankly, very few people had heard of within the State Department. Went through the basic agent training program in the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, and of course the crash and bang courses, the firearms courses, and so forth. And then right out of basic agent training, I was assigned to what then was called the counterterrorism branch. And I had basically no experience in terrorism. I'd been a patrol cop, and a job that I did like, and now I had stepped into clearly something that I was probably, in retrospect, greatly unprepared for. And initially in 1986, I started training in 85. We only had 3 of us for the world. And I was assigned the Middle East, which subsequently turned out to be, any group that operated out of the Middle East. So my portfolio included, the likes of Hezbollah, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine,
Right.
the Black September Organization, Abu Nidal, your usual suspects, and one of the big cases that I had was all the American hostages that were held captive in Lebanon, primarily as we focused our attention on trying to find CIA Station Chief Bill Buckley. And that was the purpose of our hostage location task force that was actually stood up at the CIA at the time to try to find Bill. And we figured that if we could find Bill, we could find all the other American hostages. And, you know, Chris and Mike, in between that, we were running aircraft bombings, hijackings, plane crashes, you name it, to include, the bombing of Pan Am 103 out of Lockerbie, Scotland.
Right. We really wanted to have you on because our book of the month this month, we're a Mid-Trap podcast. We cover all of Vince Vign's books. And so this month we're doing American Assassin. And as we're reading it, right, it's set in this time period right around, I think, right around the time when you got involved, or right after. And Vince keeps bringing up this idea of how America was sort of out of the game. And listening to your story on Danger Close, and also beginning to read your books, you're almost like entering as Mitch Rapp is entering. So I wonder if you could sort of expand on this idea of why Vince kept on bringing this, that we were out of the game and we needed to get into the game.
It's a great question. And I think Vince's extraordinary research at that time period was simply spot on. I think that he articulated so well in his thriller American Assassin exactly what we were dealing with. Chris and Mike, we lacked human intelligence. We lacked an operational capability in Beirut. Obviously, the first embassy bombing, which is certainly covered in American Assassin 2 by Vince in April of 1983, sent shockwaves across the U.S. intelligence community. We were blinded. We never saw it coming. And then, of course, the man that was sent in to kind of rebuild the eyes and ears for the U.S. intelligence community in Beirut was William F. Buckley, or Bill Buckley. And, at the time, Bill was 55 years old and extraordinarily decorated hero from my perspective. The recipient of 2 Silver Stars, had fought as a young kid in the Korean War, and then gone back and gotten his college degree, then went off to Vietnam and became one of Kennedy's first Green Berets, and then spent his entire life in the intelligence community, predominantly in the CIA Special Activities Division.
Yes.
Which sounds a lot like where Mitch Rapp works, from my read of American Assassin, which I have to say was a very, very good book. And Vince painted a picture so eloquently through fiction of exactly what we were experiencing when we were looking for the hostages in Beirut.
And there's a lot of parallels between the different events you mentioned and what happens in a lot of Vince's stories. And I was blown away reading your retelling of Beirut in the 80s and into the late 80s, and some of the direct parallels to the story here in American Assassin. For example, if you can give us a feeling of what the city was like, because Vince describes it as a post-Civil War, there's a bit of a ceasefire, yet many factions are still vying for territory and power. You would see bombed out buildings being claimed by the Maronite Christians on one side, and then the Shia influences who were funding groups like Hezbollah, trying to take buildings and fight for territory. And Vince uses this green line, I think Hamra Street, showing the divide. Do you think he's giving us a real good picture of Beirut at the time, amidst the kidnappings, the bombings, and towards the tail end of the Civil War?
Mike, Vince painted a picture in American Assassin of exactly what Beirut was like during this time period. I think the scenario is 1989 or the year thereabouts.
Right.
And the place was in chaos. And that was part of the problem with our inability to have any accurate on ground intelligence. And look, it was like Casablanca. It was where every intelligence service was operating,
Right.
from the Americans to the French to the British to the Israelis to the Lebanese Christians. And then, of course, we had this group called Islamic Jihad,
Right.
which we quite frankly couldn't figure out exactly who they were. We would argue about that, and we just could not make sense of the dynamics because there were so many actors and so many players on the ground there. And the city was war torn, and it was led by clans and families and terrorist organizations. And it was like nomad. It was like Escape from New York in one of these, films where you really couldn't get a handle on who was the good guys and who was the bad guys. And people were getting kidnapped and people were getting shot at. And, Westerners were being kidnapped. And, one of the things that, it really made me think when I was reading American Assassin, guys, that when Vince depicted, the hostage holding locations, I vividly harken back to my debriefings of numerous hostages that we brought out of Lebanon, and the way they painted the picture of how the hostage guards worked and their torture and the solitary confinement and the unsanitary conditions, and they could hear sounds at times, and I think Vince just painted that with a skill that is very rare. In that, although it's fiction, it reads like a nonfiction story.
Right.
When you're looking at that time period in Beirut.
It's crazy. You bring up the details that you spoke with people in those holding facilities, because there's one scene in the book where the different clans and factions of the terrorist leadership are arguing about human excrement and if their men should be allowed to, do their business in the buildings. And then one's like, make your guys walk to the roof and do it there. And so it sounds like for our guys who were on the ground, that's exactly what was happening. And then Vince even used two names. Badruddin came up in your book briefly, and Imad Mugniya. I just couldn't believe it when I was reading your nonfiction, and Vince used all the details, including some of the names of these groups.
Yeah, he did extraordinarily good research in piecing this together. The Badruddin was certainly one of the hostage holders that we actually suspected that was involved. We knew that Imad Mugniya, his code name was the Fox. We knew that he was actively involved in not only the kidnapping of Bill Buckley, but many other Westerners, to include the hijacking of TWA Flight 847, as well as the bombings of the U.S. Embassy in 83 and in 84, and the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Kuwait. Before Osama bin Laden came around, Mugniya was the poster child for terror. And as a result of that, we had a very large bounty on his head, but we could never catch him because we just simply lacked the intelligence resources during that time period. But what I think Vince did so magnificently is that the confusion that we had back in Washington of trying to make sense of this threat landscape and trying to figure out who actually held the hostages. We would argue about that. What was the degree of Iranian control? What role did the Russians play in this, if any? And much like we're chatting now, we would go back and forth, and we just lacked that tactical insight to be able to say definitively. And I think Vince painted that picture well with some of the scenes between Mugniya and Fatah, which was the Palestinians, and then, of course, you've got the Russians in play.
Right.
And you've got the Iranians in play. So it was damn good work on his part in painting that scene.
You mentioned something there, and it makes me think of something that Rapp often encounters in many of his books, but it's this idea of coming up against bureaucracy and politicians. And I wonder if you could expand on if you ever encountered any of those frustrations throughout your time in the intelligence world.
That was a daily occurrence.
I bet.
You felt at times that you were just pushing boulders up a hill.
How do you overcome it? How do you overcome it?
Well, you simply do what Mitch Rapp did, and that's you go around it, you go through it,
right.
You end run it, you try to cut corners if you can. Surprisingly, and I've worked through many, many different administrations, both Republicans and Democrats, and behind the scenes, there's always a cadre of people like Mitch that just get the job done. And they let the bureaucrats deal with, the hand wringing in Washington. But there's always prices to be paid for that. For example, I've gotten much, much more credit than I deserve for this, but I was involved with the capture of Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind of the first World Trade Center bombing. And we just got lucky. But we had a very short window of time to capture him. And I knew that if we had played by the rules, we would lose him. So I chose not to play by the rules, and we captured him. Now, of course, there was hell to pay afterwards because Washington can be a very vindictive place. But when you start talking about bureaucracy in Washington, especially in the 80s, where the late 80s, where American Assassin takes place, this was a time period, remember, before 9/11. And we were always under-resourced, understaffed, which, Vince alludes to in American Assassin about how the Americans were losing and losing badly. And we were. And terrorism just really wasn't a priority. And it's hard to imagine that today because of our endless wars since 9/11. But in those days, terrorism just really wasn't viewed on the same scale as it was. It took 9/11 to happen for the world to wake up as to what we were facing, even though many had suffered and bled horribly as a result of this.
Do you think that if, you mentioned you were one of 3 people that, joined in the beginning of the diplomatic security service, do you think if we had gotten a better handle early on, would we have been able to prevent 9/11, or was something like that always inevitable?
I think most certainly we could have. If we had terrorism as a national priority, it wasn't at that time. Remember, the whole intelligence operations were set up in a Cold War kind of environment where we were looking at Russia and the evil empire. And terrorism was not really viewed as a strategic threat against America. It was a tactical concern. Yeah, we understand that diplomats are going to get assaulted or kidnapped or occasionally murdered overseas. But, quite frankly, and I'm a student of attacks on diplomatic facilities. I've been writing about them for a long time now and lived through many, is that if you look in the 70s, there was a relentless tempo of kidnappings and murders of diplomats. And in the 80s, where American Assassin takes place, the backdrop is just as bad, if not worse, because we had suffered these catastrophic attacks in Beirut specifically, with the bombings of the embassies and the Marine barracks. And then, of course, the CIA station chief. I mean, think about it in concept. One day in 1979, you had the U.S. Embassy in Tehran that was overran and seized. But what most people don't realize, that same day in Kabul, Afghanistan, the United States ambassador was kidnapped and murdered.
Same day.
Wow,
Same day.
I didn't know that.
Right. Most people don't.
Huh.
Think of the political fallout on Benghazi with the horrific killing of Ambassador Chris Stevens, which I wrote about, but it was just a different era.
Right.
And you didn't have the 24/7, news. You didn't have social media.
Right.
So then if you step back in this time period where Vince is writing about an American Assassin, it was almost like, okay, we've had another bombing or we've had another killing, let's go try to figure out what happened and wait for the next one.
So many points I want to bring up, and that last one just has me thinking. I almost wish I could read your writing about that, which I should hope at some point we'll be able to. But I'm just thinking about this ever-changing world and this ever-changing threat and what that means, well, for America going forward, but I'm thinking for Mitch Rapp going forward. Kyle Mills is really charged now with updating the series, bringing it to the modern era. As he said many a times, Vince during his lifetime did not see the rise of ISIS. And so various things like that keep changing and evolving on the field of battle or the field of intelligence. So how would you say we've responded? And a second part to that is, do you feel the political wind shifting in the sense that we are quite far removed, a full generation or two removed from 9/11? Have we learned our lessons, or are we at a crossroads where we might have been a little caught unawares, like we were, in the early 80s in Beirut? Are we headed down that path with the political wind shifting away from, I would say, some of the intelligence services, particularly with the last administration being fortified and strengthened and supported? Or do you see us moving in a good place to also adapt to these ongoing threats?
Well, I think you raise a very good question, Mike. I think that what we're looking at as you forecast, and I know as you start thinking about the kind of problems that Mitch Rapp can hopefully resolve for us in the future, you can only look at how we were blindsided as a nation with the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And then you look at cyber and the confluence of physical and cyber today, and the never-ending struggle to stay in front of that. And when you start looking at that, is when are we going to see some kinetic response as a result of a major cyber attack? Mm. So, for example, what's the threshold for that? Right now, you have companies being attacked and an extraordinary amount of financial loss. But will it take something as catastrophic as all the lights turning green in America one day? So there's horrific loss of automobile accidents. Correct. And then how do you identify who's behind that? And then are you going to hold them accountable for such actions?
Right.
Or is Mitch Rapp going to go in
to
extract his degree of retribution, not vengeance, but retribution as a result of that? So if you look out over the horizon, it's a wonderful time to be a fiction plot writer to put together possible scenarios that could be facing our nation.
You have a lot to work with.
You certainly do.
Kind of in the same vein, how do you feel the mission, if you will, of our intelligence service and apparatus, in addition to switching to cyber, do you see it needing to make a switch towards the home front with the degree of civil disobedience or the rise of domestic extremist groups? Do you see that as a threat in any way that we need to get ahead of? Or is that something less on your radar than some of these foreign external threats?
No, I think the events of January the 6th at the U.S. Capitol was certainly a wake-up call, but we've had many others. For example, I was at FBI headquarters the day that the bombing in Oklahoma City took place.
Right.
And we were convinced that was Hezbollah, again, back to Beirut. Just based upon the modeling, if you can visualize the damage and put that federal building up against the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, either one of the bombings, they look almost identical. And that was a hell of a big bomb. And we were completely blindsided by the fact that could be done domestically by an individual or a very small secretive cell that we knew nothing about. And that's the challenge today with the McVeighs of the future in what is called a leaderless resistance model, meaning if the three of us have formed a terrorist organization, domestic or international, the likelihood of the FBI picking us off might be good, or one of us going forward and being worked as a double agent. But if you act alone, similar to like what Sirhan did, or Lee Harvey Oswald, or John Hinckley, for the most part, you can be successful, provided you know how to put together, for example, a VBIED like McVeigh did. So, it's a daunting challenge. And, the FBI, the one thing that I do fear as I sit back and have been in this business since 1981 is that the FBI has so much responsibility, so much turf that they're responsible for globally, is I do worry that they can be stretched too thin at times. And do they really have a good handle on the domestic threat extremists, either the left or the right, that could potentially rear their ugly heads and carry out another Oklahoma City-like bombing?
Right. Wow. I want to go back to something you said, and if you could just elaborate a little bit more. I know you talked about it a lot on Danger Close with Jack Carr, but just your involvement with Ramzi Youssef. Would you consider that one of your biggest accomplishments? I mean, it was just amazing. How you tracked him down, and I mean, you said you got lucky, but I think it was a little bit more than luck.
Well, no, Chris, I kind of view what Ramzi Youssef was capable of doing as a failure on our part, meaning
True.
His success in the 93 World Trade Center bombing, we had no idea. And you got to go back before that. I actually worked the assassination of Rabbi Meir Kahane in New York City by El Sayed Nosser, who was an Egyptian assassin who shot Kahane, and he was part of the group that put together the World Trade Center bombing. Again, we were blinded. We had no forewarning that was going to take place. So I view that as an intelligence failure. And, quite frankly, Yosef was, he was trying to kill the Pope in the Philippines. He was putting bombs on aircraft. He was on a global terror, kind of streak, the likes of which we hadn't seen for years. And I was really not convinced that our source that helped us locate Yosef was good to begin with. And we had one of the programs that my office ran was the Rewards for Justice program, which has got a lot of attention over the 20 million for bin Laden. Right. In those days, the most we had to spend was, I think, 5 million, but it was still a lot of money. And we had a lot of people coming forward with Yosef sightings all around the world. And I was skeptical until, the source actually produced. So, sometimes in this business, you do get lucky. It's rare, but sometimes you do. And, do I view that as a great accomplishment? I think, I'm very happy that we were able to capture him and bring him to justice so he couldn't kill again. But I also recognize that he was responsible for a lot of death and carnage before we caught him. So, I do have mixed emotions on that.
Yeah, it's amazing how much of our accomplishments in this field were so close to being disasters. And it seems a very thin line. And our role, we would hope, is to broaden that thin line, make it a little thicker. So if we were to double down on protecting the homeland, and let's say that should become a major focus of whether it's a future election or a budgeting process or just shifting the political will in that direction, what would you recommend is the first step? Do we strengthen signal intelligence? Do we have to double down on electronic communications? Is it human intelligence? Do we need more guys out in the field, eyes and ears, undercover operatives? Where do we need to rebuild or strengthen the most, would you say, in this really just complex, ever-changing world of threats?
Well, I think when you look at great power, namely, you're talking about the United States, China, and Russia at a 30,000 foot level. It's been that way for a good 30 years now, and I don't see that shifting. So you have to start looking at great power initiatives and espionage and national security from that perspective. And that's a strategic kind of issue. You have to have enough warnings and tripwires in place to eliminate another Pearl Harbor, another 9/11, another Oklahoma City. And that requires, a very holistic kind of approach when you start looking at threats against our homeland. Now, the challenge you have with that is that in today's world, there's so much information and so many threat streams that are coming at you. And I think for the most part, the intelligence community does a very good job of sifting through the noise and trying to focus on the signals that are really important. And quite frankly, the FBI has done a good job of preventing another strategic strike on U.S. soil. You're not going to, I hate to break it for your listeners, but you're not going to stop every active shooter,
right?
Every mass shooter, anybody that wants to pick up an AR-15 and start shooting people. That's extraordinarily difficult to prevent. But you can stop the next World Trade Center and the Oklahoma cities and so forth. And that takes a very robust, laser-focused, predominantly FBI here domestically. But again, it's much like the Secret Service mandate. There's a lot of mission creep with federal law enforcement agencies. And one has to worry about, are they spread too thin? If I was in charge, which I'll never will be, but if I was, I would refocus a lot of these different agencies' responsibilities and kind of narrow those gaps. But you're touching the third rail and the holy grail in Washington of headcount and budgets and politics and Congress and lobbyists. And good luck on that.
Right.
Can I ask, because just being, a layperson, no military, no intelligence background of any sort, just a social studies teacher who likes history and government and politics. Sometimes when I hear about reorganizations or efforts to roll out the next committee, the next task force, or joint operations, and it seems like a political play sometimes, when that's in a stump speech or when that's the main headline coming out of a budget bill. How can someone like me, a consumer of news and media in this day and age, know what's BS, but what is also like verified, that someone like you would say, yeah, that's a shakeup we need, as opposed to my critic's eye just saying, oh, this is that bullshit Mitch Rapp would be against, the kind of stuff he'd roll his eyes about and kick and scream. But it sounds like a reorg like that could be very beneficial. How would I tell the difference?
Well, it's tough. It's hard to make sense of that. But let me back up and say something, Mike. Don't underestimate the importance that you serve in the education of our youth and young minds. And trust me when I say you are probably making an extraordinary difference in those kids' lives. And I had teachers like that through my entire schoolings that kept me on the straight and narrow and at least tried to help.
We've got some young analysts coming up the pipeline. I mean, some of the things and the ways they can think, I hope you guys recruit them, I hope Irene Kennedy's out there snatching a few up, because they're bright, a lot of these kids.
I'm sure. I know. I talk to a lot of them all the time.
Good.
Well, yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, you can look at the politicization of all of these. For example, we would call them inside the Beltway witch hunts,
right?
Or after action reports and studies, and they usually put together a panel of experts. But again, what happens as a result of that is you have so many people in play that, again, are trying to navigate loss of headcount or an increase of headcount or an increase of budget. And some things, can be done on a practical level, but Washington never really tries to do that. And, you look at the, horrific events of the fallout of Benghazi, for example. And, that's the kind of attack that the State Department Diplomatic Security Service has a long history of being involved with. And you start thinking through that just from a logical perspective and say, well, why in the heck are just 5 agents there by themselves with the ambassador on 9/11? And it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Right.
But on a practical level, the United States ambassador in any country is a king, and Washington rarely can tell them what to do, if anything. They typically report directly to the NSC or the White House and a bifurcated line to state. So, they're out there on their own. And so, some of these problems are systemic, institutional. You look at an organization like the U.S. Capitol Police, which I'm very familiar with. It's a good organization. Why weren't they not better prepared? Well, there's 1,000 reasons why. And, it's just tragic that these events unfold. But, the one thing that I think also that Vince has done with his books, and he's also depicted as to how quickly things go south, is what we say, meaning it's never really one thing that causes these disasters to happen. There's usually a systemic failure along a line, and it's like a domino effect. Meaning,
Right.
if you look at when Bill Buckley was kidnapped, for example, in Lebanon, he was living off compound. He was driving himself to work.
Right.
He was living off on the economy. That makes no sense today.
Shouldn't have been doing
Yeah.
that.
I couldn't believe that. Hearing he would just, kind of stroll around the city and lived in an apartment off complex. I was like, what?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And operationally, he thought that was the best way for him to be able to do his job, but he paid a very heavy price for making those decisions. But my point being is that it wasn't just one isolated event that caused that to happen. There's always this domino effect with all of these cases. And then after they happen, you can go back and say, well, my goodness, why didn't you do A, B, C, D, E, and F? And sometimes, guys, in Washington, I've seen this my entire career, is I was never trained to protect anybody when the building was set on fire. Now, the agents going through basic agent training at the State Department train to protect someone. They set the building on fire, and you train. And the one takeaway that you can say for sure in this space is that catastrophe forces change. And it's usually that and that only that causes change.
Right. We have to learn from our mistakes. And if we don't, then it makes it even worse. Right.
Right, Chris.
Before we started recording, you mentioned that the downing of the Pan Am flight over Lockerbie, Scotland. You mentioned this on the pod with Jack Carr, that you lost 3 agents in that. I wanted to know if you could sort of expand on if you played any role in that investigation, because this is a key event in the backstory of Mitch Rapp. So we just wanted to pick your brain a little bit more about that.
Sure. Yeah, I'll never forget that day. I always mark it on my calendar, and I say a prayer every December 21st, because that's when Lockerbie crashed, December 21st, 1988. I was in our counterterrorism division at the time. I can't remember if I had been promoted up to the deputy chief of that division at the time. I'm just really not sure off the top of my head. But the plane went down. We knew that we had a whole bunch of Americans coming home for the holidays. Again, it was 4 days before Christmas. And we would have travel cables, like when an agent left a post. And so, for example, if an agent was traveling out of Beirut, they would send a travel cable back. So, it wasn't like today with the internet where you could very quickly collate travel data and patterns and this and that. We had to ramp up and try to determine who was aboard that aircraft, like in any plane crash. State Department Operations Center was doing that. We learned that we had a a whole group of students from Syracuse University that were aboard the flight. We knew we had American diplomats on the flight. And so we had a problem with a range of different issues. We had to account and make sure that where our people were, we were looking at things such as, were there any diplomatic pouches aboard that aircraft that somebody might have been carrying? Quite frankly, we did not know for many, many hours. We were trying to put together a manifest. We were hoping some people did not get on the flight, quite frankly. I actually traveled over to Cyprus, and we were bringing some of our personnel out of Beirut and interviewing them concerning the travel arrangements and, when did they schedule. We were looking at the possibility of the flight being specifically targeted or compromised to some degree because our personnel was on board. And remember, you had, and it's every international investigation that I've been a part of, and many, such as, the plane crash which killed President Zia of Pakistan. I was on that investigation too. There's confusion, there's chaos, there's multiple agencies involved. In Pan Am 103, we had the National Transportation Safety Board, we had the FBI, we had the CIA, we had the State Department, we had DOD. Then you had the British Security Service, MI6. You had the Irish National Police. You had the Scottish authorities.
Interpol,
and then you have
with Kyle's father, I believe. Or no, was he the FBI liaison for... I know Kyle Mills, his father, had some involvement as well. I forget what angle he came from. I think FBI.
Yeah, I think it was FBI, yeah.
I'm not sure of that specific point, but yes, Interpol obviously plays a role in these cases, and you're trying to figure out, are there other bombs on other planes too, while you're dealing with that disaster. Then you're doing a tremendous amount of triage and crisis management with that, and so you're working with the airline carrier too, Pan Am. And you're trying to reconstruct exactly where that plane had been over the last 72 hours before it took off. And so you're trying to put together other passenger lists. You're running name checks on everybody that was aboard that flight. And then you're praying that, some of the folks that you might have known didn't make it aboard. That investigation was in many ways heartbreaking. One of the most complex can of worms that's still speculated today as to, who might have actually been responsible for it. I still see reports of that. Every time I get a Google alert on Pan Am, 103, I take a look at it because I'm still interested in the case. And, we had a forensic link to Libya, which was pretty strong. And, but then again, there's always speculation that, was that a false flag? Could that have been Iran? Could that have been Hezbollah? Some of my colleagues from that time period in the intelligence community, they're really kind of split. So it's the kind of case, guys, that will we ever know the truth? I'm not so sure. But it was certainly one of those events that for the rest of my life, I will certainly remember. And, the thing about that case too, is in those days, we did very little screening of luggage going into aircraft holds. And again, I forget the flight number we had before 103, but we had another bombing that wasn't as bad. And I think the plane was able to land, but it was one of the vulnerabilities that was identified as to, look, let's be smart about this. Let's just screen for bombs. You think about that today.
Right. Dogs everywhere.
Like, yeah.
You have to take off your shoes. You have to take off everything.
Yeah.
Right. And in those days, it was, well, who's going to pay for it? Whose
Right.
responsibility is it?
Right.
But, we learned a lot from that bombing. And I would like to say, without a doubt, that as a result of that bombing, that aviation security globally got a hell of a lot safer.
Right.
And the world recognized that we need some basic security, such as let's screen for bombs. And
Right.
it was just a time period, 1988.
And that's why we have the Orion team and Mitch Rapp, So there's another positive spin.
Right. I tell you what, I was so struck by reading American Assassin it was almost like Mitch Rapp was sitting in our office, reading the cable traffic. And, I'll tell you, I don't think I've written about this before, but I'll tell you guys this. One of the things my office had was the Rewards for Justice program. And we always wanted, at that time when Pan Am 103 crashed, we had a $2 million maximum bounty. And we decided internally that the only $2 million we would pay would be for someone who brought the bomber to us, whether we could capture, kill, whatever. And unfortunately, we never got an opportunity to do that. But the closest we came was we paid the informant that set up Ramzi Youssef $1.2 million. But we were withholding that $2 million threshold to capture the persons responsible for the Pan Am 103 bombing. I think Vince would have liked that.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm surprised. Do you think, Chris, in any of the books we have a bounty program like that on our end, on the American side of things? I don't know if Vince...
No, Vince never brought that up.
I don't think he brought... We'll have to look carefully through the books. But do you think, though, there's a chance this could be, and I know we're decades out, it could be one of those cases where something or someone is still out there and we're getting to the age where they're getting older, the last generation of people with inside knowledge or who had a hand are looking at the end of their life, and might there be a source somewhere? Or is this just a cold case, lock it away, we got all the evidence you think we'll ever have? Or do things sometimes come out at about this point?
Well, I'm always optimistic. I think you raise a good point. When I look back at some of my cold cases that I've worked, you can always hope that it could happen. But if you look at just the geopolitics of the potential players that are involved, Gaddafi was taken out.
Right.
Both the Libyan bombers that were allegedly responsible for this, they have passed away. So if you start looking at Iran, yes, you could always hope for, let's say, for example, a defector to come to us from their intelligence service and bring evidence, or a smoking gun out. There's always hope that somebody from Hezbollah would defect, or we could snatch them and they would own up to that. But it's been a long time. And, that's part of the challenge with these cases, too. It was so long ago. Who is really remembering those events, unless you're some old timer like me, or Vince when he's writing about them in American Assassin. So, which is a good. As tragic as the entire hostage situation was in Beirut, and certainly the horrific bombing of Pan Am 103, I like the fact that Vince wrote about that, because forever that will be in a book for people to read and remember. And much like we're chatting today, think about, well, I wonder what happened with that case.
Right.
So you never know what these kinds of stories spark.
Yeah.
Yeah. Most of the time, I'm a scientist. I'm not a geography teacher like Mike. So most of the time when I read these books, whether it be Brad Thor, Vince, or Jack, I'm reading about these events for the first time, and then that allows me to then go on and then I read a book like from you, to learn, the nonfiction side. So yeah, I think that's great. You captured that perfectly, that this documents it, and hopefully that it, sparks an interest, many years down the road. What was this bombing? So, well, we don't want to keep you too long, but we do want to ask you, one last thing. So, you've written, a couple really great books. Highly recommend our listeners to check them out. But what's in the works right now? What are you currently up to?
Yeah, what's next?
Well, unfortunately, I recently lost my literary agent to cancer. So I'm kind of in a little bit of a holding pattern for the time being. But I do have another project that is plodding along, and of course, it's going to be a story like Beirut Rules. The older I get, guys, the hourglass of time is kind of turned against me, and there's some cases that I think still need some transparency, and I want to shine a light on some of them. And every one of the books that I've written so far has resulted in kind of a long tail of other people coming forward and bringing something new to light as a result of that. We're much like us today talking about, the wonderful fiction that Vince Flynn wrote that's so mirror image to my time period with Beirut Rules. But that's what I always try to do with my stories. So I've got another one like that that's in the works. And, I'm highly optimistic that, just predicated on the books I've had published in the past, that this one will be published too. Once I nail down a new literary agent, that's what I'll be doing.
Okay.
All right. Look forward to that.
Well, you are not just an encyclopedia of knowledge on the history of American intelligence, but also a primary source to all these historical events. So whatever you continue to educate the public on and spill the beans in these stories and that need to be told, we will be right there following along. So please keep us updated. We'll look for your posts. And so speaking of that, the people, where can they find you? Where can they follow your work? I know you're on Twitter. Any other platforms you want to plug and let the people know how to follow you?
Sure, that's very kind of you, Mike. I'm certainly on all the social media platforms, on Twitter, at Fred_Burton, or you can find me at officialfredburton.com. I have to thank Jack Carr and Brad Thor for being tremendous friends in the thriller space with utilizing my books and helping promote my books and the assistance of their books. So they're just wonderful guys. And I thank you for what you do and, for keeping Vince's memory alive. And certainly I look forward to reading all of his books, and I'm not there yet, but I'll get there.
Well, cool. Let us know once you get there what you think.
Yes.
I will. But I have to plug this before you guys go. Your listeners do need to read American Assassin.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. They do.
Well, thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it. It was very enlightening, very educational.
My pleasure. Thank you guys for having me.
Well, we hope you guys really enjoyed the interview as much as me and Mike did. That was really nice talking to Fred. He's such a nice, kind guy.
Right. It's a good soul.
Yeah, very much so.
And he's done so much for our country. He was involved in so many of these important historical events of the last 3 decades, really. It's just incredible. 4 decades even.
Yes, very, true patriot right there.
And
patriot.
More recently, since we talked, I picked up a copy of Under Fire about the untold story of the attack in Benghazi. So I know a lot of you guys, and we loved the movie 13 Hours. Fred is also an expert on the events and the failures of, the diplomatic security service and the slow response, and unfortunately the loss of life of American personnel in the Benghazi attack. Well, Fred also wrote a book on that. So, Chris, that's my next book I'm going to read now that I just picked it up.
Yes, and I highly encourage any of our listeners to go give any of his books, pick a copy up. Beirut Rules, Ghost,
Under Fire is the
Under
new one.
Fire. So they're all really good. I read a couple of sections of Beirut Rules, and it even though it's nonfiction, at times it felt like fiction, or it felt like historical fiction. So yeah, he's a great author. Nice talking to him.
Yeah, he also, talking about just being a good soul, he sent us some pictures, direct primary sources from his time in the field. One of them, he's on a plane debriefing a hostage after a release that he was involved in. And then another is the original wanted poster through the Rewards for Justice program for Imad Mugniya, who plays a major role in American Assassin. So a historical character that Vince decided to write in his books. And Fred was one of the architects of a rewards program to collect intelligence that would lead to his capture. And we got a photograph of one of those first posters. So thank you, Fred. We'll be posting on our social media those incredible documents that he shared with us. So again, just an intelligent patriot and glad to say friend of the podcast now.
Yes, good friend of the podcast. So, as we always do, we have to thank our patrons, including our special operator, Sherry F., our special agents, George, Matt, Dawn, Dennis, Peggy, Catherine, Ray, Bridget, Jeff, and Mark. Please, we said it at the top, I'll say it again, subscribe, rate, review us on your favorite podcasting platform. You can find us online at mitrappod.com or on Twitter and Instagram at mitrappod. And as always, just let Mitch be Mitch.
See you Wednesday.
See you Wednesday. Live.
9 p.m. Eastern Time, coming at you. Mitrap Pod.
Mitrap Pod live podcast. Just a disclaimer, this podcast is not affiliated with Vince Flynn, Kyle Mills, or Simon & Schuster, but thank you to them for bringing us the wonderful world of Rapp. And the music soundtrack is Guerrilla Tactics by Raphael Crux.